Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're taking a little different route today, sort of like taking a scenic detour through the back roads of forest history. And that's especially for our friends over at ECN, right there in Ashley County, Arkansas. Cross it. You guys are living and breathing it every day, the forestry capital of the South, no less. So we know you're all about the woods, the old growth, the sustainable stuff, the silviculture, all of it.
Absolutely. And there's no better place to understand all that than by diving into the story of how American forests got to where they are today.
Right. So we're digging into Douglas W. McCleary's American Forests, the one subtitled A History of Resiliency and Recovery, published by those Forest History Society folks.
Great book. Think about it. For folks in Ashley County, this history is not just in a book. It's in the land they walk on, the trees they work with.
Exactly. It's like the roots running deep. So we're going to pull out the big takeaways from McCleary's research. We'll look at how the forests have changed over time, how they bounced back after some tough times, and how we've, tried to manage them along the way.
Right. And we'll definitely be hitting on those points about old growth, sustainability, and the whole silviculture angle that we know is near and dear to your hearts down there in Crossett.
So let's set the scene right. Take a trip back in time with me. Before the Europeans showed up, what did these American forests look like? I mean, McCleary talks about a mind-boggling amount of trees.
Oh, yeah. Picture this. Almost 1 billion acres of forest. That's like half of the entire U.S. land area today. And get this, about 3/4 of that was all crammed into the eastern third of the continent. Today, we're still sitting at a pretty impressive 751 million acres, which is nothing to sniff at, but, gives you an idea of the scale of change we're talking about.
Wow, that's a lot of trees.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just one massive identical forest, was it? He talks about all these different types of forests all over the place.
Oh, tons of variety. Up in New England, you had this blend of deciduous and coniferous trees. Totally different vibe from the South, where pines ruled the coastal plains in the Piedmont region. And then you had these incredible central hardwood forests, like a sea of oak, hickory, and maple, spreading across those middle latitudes. And then, as you get closer to the prairies, the scene shifts again. You get these oak and pine savannas, sort of like a blending zone. And way up north around the Great Lakes, the boreal forests did their own thing. It was like this giant, intricate quilt of different ecosystems, each with its own personality. Fascinating. But here's a little mind bender, something that challenges our usual picture of these pre-settlement forests. They weren't exactly untouched wilderness, right? McCleary points to the Native Americans who were already shaping these forests. Oh yeah, it's easy to romanticize the past, but this pristine wilderness idea, it's not really the whole story. Native American communities weren't just living in these forests, they were actively managing them. And one of their main tools, fire.
Fire, really. That's not the first thing that pops into my head when I think about early American forests. Why were they using fire, and how?
Well, for a bunch of reasons. Think about it. Fire's a powerful force. They were real pros at using it to shape the landscape, making it work for their way of life. Fire helped create better habitat for game animals, easier hunting, right? It also cleared out the underbrush, which, let's be honest, nobody wants to be wading through. It made travel easier and reduced the risk of those massive, out-of-control wildfires that can really do some damage. And fire, believe it or not, actually helps certain food plants to thrive, like berries and nuts. So it had all these practical benefits, and sometimes they even used it to drive game during hunts. It was a way of life.
So it was a pretty sophisticated system. And I think McCleary gives some specific regional examples of how this all played out, right? Different folks, different forests.
Yeah, he does. He talks about how, in New England, historical records suggest they were regularly setting controlled burns, sometimes even twice a year. This helped to thin things out, create more open woodlands. And then down south, in those long-leaf pine savannas, those signature landscapes of the coastal plain and Piedmont, fire was like their lifeblood. These weren't your typical dense forests. They were more open and park-like because of these fires. Even in the Appalachian hardwood forests, fire played its part in shaping the structure and types of trees that dominated.
It's interesting, we picture these lush, untouched forests, but the reality is more dynamic. And man, those open pine savannas. It's hard to wrap my head around how fire helped create them. Seems counterintuitive, but nature is full of surprises.
It is. It's like the more you learn, the more you realize how much we don't know. But with these savannas, the key is that those frequent fires prevented the buildup of all that dense undergrowth that would normally choke things out. They actually favored those fire-tolerant species, the tough guys like longleaf pine and certain oaks. And guess what? This created some awesome habitats for a ton of different plants and animals. McCleary even talks about how there used to be elk and bison roaming around those eastern forests, which tells you there are more grasslands than we might imagine. Think about it, the Shenandoah Valley, for instance. Now it's beautiful, but it used to be this massive prairie, all kept open by those intentional burns. And then you had millions of acres of oak and pine savannas on the edges of the eastern forests, where the fires from the prairies would sweep in and shape the landscape. It was a whole different world.
So basically, what we might picture as the natural state of those forests when Europeans arrived was already being shaped by human hands.
Hmm.
And that's going to make us rethink how we manage forests today, doesn't it?
For sure. It raises a whole bunch of questions that we're still grappling with. Like, if fire's been such a big part of these ecosystems for, who knows, thousands of years, how do we incorporate that into our conservation efforts now? Should we be trying to, mimic those historical burning patterns? And if so, how do we do that safely when there's so many people living near these forests? It's a reminder that the forests we see today aren't some static thing. They've been shaped by this long, ongoing conversation between humans and nature.
It's like a dance. And speaking of changes, let's talk about what happened when those European settlers started arriving in earnest, around the 1500s up through 1785. McCleary talks about a real clash of perspectives between the old world and the new.
Yeah, Europe back then was all about scarce land and abundant labor. And, land in America seemed limitless. But labor, well, that was always in short supply. And this kind of flip dynamic really shaped how the colonists went about their business, especially when it came to the forests.
Makes sense. Cheap, plentiful land, you're going to clear it, use those resources, especially when labor is what's holding you back. What were some of the early ways the colonists went about doing that? What were the first industries that really tapped into these forests?
Well, even before those big permanent settlements popped up, you had certain industries that left their mark, like the fur trade and the Atlantic fishery. They had a huge impact. For instance, those fancy beaver pelts were all the rage in Europe, created this massive trade network reaching deep into the continent. And then off the coast, you had the Grand Banks teeming with cod and other fish, practically an endless supply of food in a major export commodity early on.
And we can't forget about timber, right? I mean, we're talking to the forestry capital here, and I bet those early exports are part of their story, too.
You bet. Just 1 year after the Pilgrims set foot on Plymouth Rock, they were already loading up ships with clapboard to send back to England. You see, England's forests had been, well, pretty much stripped bare, especially the good stuff for shipbuilding. So those American colonies became a lifeline. They needed white pine for masts, tough oak planks, cedar that wouldn't rot. By the mid-1600s, there was a booming trade in all sorts of forest products: timber, tar, pitch, turpentine, you name it.
So right off the bat, those American forests were playing a starring role in the global economy. But for the colonists themselves, their relationship with the forest was a little more complicated, wasn't it? It was both a provider and a problem.
Exactly. On the one hand, the forest was a lifeline. Fuel to keep warm and cook food, timber for building homes and making tools, game to put meat on the table. But it also got in the way. It took up land they desperately needed for farming. It hid wild animals that could prey on their livestock. And in those early days, you never knew what dangers might be lurking in those deep woods. So yeah, it was a love-hate relationship for sure.
That's an interesting point. It's this double-edged sword, this resource obstacle thing, and that's got to be key to understanding those early colonial days, especially since most people were farmers.
Right. I mean, think about it. In 1800, almost everyone, like 95% of the population, lived in rural areas, mostly as subsistence farmers. Clearing land to grow food was their #1 priority. The general thinking was that the forests, besides being endless, were standing in the way of progress, of building a better life, which they equated with more farms and more crops.
And how did they tackle this massive job of clearing these seemingly endless forests? Did they do things much differently than the Native Americans?
Well, they picked up a few tricks from the Native Americans, like using fire to clear the underbrush. But they also brought their own tools to the party, right? Iron axes and saws, and those powerful draft animals like oxen, which made the whole clearing process a lot faster. At first, they often went for the easier targets, those abandoned Native American fields that were already cleared. But tackling those mature forests, that was backbreaking work. McCleary mentions that it could take a single person a whole month of labor to clear just 1 acre of land. Think about that. They'd chop down trees, often leaving the stumps, or girdle them, which would kill the trees slowly and make them easier to burn later. Then they'd set fires to get rid of all the debris.
A whole month just for 1 acre? That's just wild. Helps you appreciate the sheer effort involved.
Yeah.
besides clearing land for farms, what else was using up all this timber? What was the other big thing gobbling up wood back then?
Well, one word: fences. Livestock roamed free in lots of places, so protecting those crops meant building a lot of fences. It was a constant chore, a huge consumer of time and wood. There's this account from the early 1800s that talks about the mind-boggling costs and labor of keeping up fences on a big farm. Even a small 40-acre field could need thousands of fence rails, and until wire fencing came along later in the 1800s, wood was king. So yeah, they built millions of miles of wooden fences all across the country. By 1850, they had over 3 million miles of this stuff.
That's just mind-blowing. It's like they built a wooden Great Wall of America, only it was to keep cows in, not barbarians out. But beyond building stuff and fencing things in, wood was still the main source of energy back then, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, imagine you've got this endless supply of firewood. You can stay warm even in the harshest winters. It was a luxury most folks in Europe could only dream of.
Oh.
There's this quote from one columnist who said, even a poor servant here could afford more wood than some fancy nobleman back in England. It was a sign of abundance. And in the late 1700s, something like 2/3 of all the wood they harvested went up in smoke. Heating homes, cooking food, and powering those early industries like iron production, which needed tons of charcoal. People were burning through wood like crazy. Per capita consumption was super high, sometimes like 15 to 40 cords per household every year.
Man, talk about a carbon footprint. But that had to have a real impact on the forests around those communities.
Oh yeah, McCleary gives this example of an ironworks. He says a typical operation back in the late 1700s, one that produced about 1,000 tons of iron, needed somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 acres of forest just to keep the charcoal fires burning. That's a huge chunk of forest feeding just one industry.
It's like a hungry beast. And while they're clearing the forests for farms, fuel, and everything else, what's happening to the animals that called those forests home? I have a feeling it's not good news.
Yeah, not really. Even before the mid-1700s, people started noticing that animals like deer, elk, wild turkey, and beavers were getting scarce in a lot of the settled areas. Beavers were almost completely wiped out east of the Appalachians by 1700, and bison vanished from the east before the Revolutionary War.
But was it all just about losing habitat?
Well, that's part of it, but McClear points out something interesting. In some places, all that clearing actually created new habitat that could have supported some of these animals. The bigger problem: unrestricted hunting, plain and simple. It was like a free-for-all. There were no real rules, no limits, so people had no reason to hold back, to think about the future. If they didn't take the animals, someone else would. And it's a real contrast to Europe, where hunting was often reserved for the wealthy folks. But in the colonies, anyone could grab a gun and head out.
So you've got this combination of relentless land clearing and a total lack of wildlife management, a recipe for disaster. And now we're moving into the 1800s, the era of westward expansion and rapid industrial growth. Things are about to get even more intense for American forests.
They do. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 basically doubles the size of the country. And throughout the 19th century, the federal government's going all in on transferring those vast public lands into private hands. And, the population's exploding too, from around 3 million people in 1785 to over 76 million by 1900.
And all those new people needed land for farming, which meant saying goodbye to even more forests. McCleary mentions how much cropland each person needed, right?
He does. About 3 acres per person was the rule of thumb. So as more people arrived, they needed more land to grow food. It was a simple equation. By 1850, cropland had ballooned to 76 million acres from a mere 20 million at the start of the century. And by 1900, it was a whopping 319 million acres, most of it carved out of forests.
And all this while the East Coast becoming a major industrial powerhouse. And even with coal starting to come into play, they still needed wood for fuel, at least in the early part of the century.
Oh, big time. In 1850, over 90% of the energy for heating still came from burning wood. Sure, they were getting more efficient wood stoves, but the sheer demand for fuel wood was insane, especially with industries like iron making booming and all those steamboats and later railroads guzzling wood. People kept burning wood at a crazy high rate, over 4 cords per person per year, well into the late 1800s.
You think about those old-timey steam locomotives, billowing smoke, and now you know where all that fuel was coming from. They must have chewed through entire forests.
Oh yeah, the railroads. They were a game changer. They called them the Iron Horse, but honestly, they ate up way more wood than iron. The train cars, the tracks, fuel for the engines, bridges, stations, fences alongside the tracks, even the telegraph poles, wood, wood, wood. And the railroad network grew like a weed, from less than 10,000 miles of track in 1850 to over 350,000 miles by 1910. By the late 1800s, some estimates say they were responsible for about 20 to 25% of the country's total timber consumption.
That's just unbelievable. And think about all those wooden railroad ties. That had to be a huge drain on the forests.
Oh yeah, each mile of track needed something like 2,500 ties, and they weren't treating them to make them last longer until after 1900. So they'd rot out in 5 to 7 years, and you had to replace them. By 1900, just replacing those railroad ties was like clearing 15 to 20 million acres of forest every year.
So even with industry growing and coal becoming more popular, they're still gobbling up wood like crazy. And it's mostly for farming and transportation. It's hard to grasp the scale of it all. And McCleary says that all that land clearing for farms kept pace with the growing population right up to the early 1900s.
Yep, between 1850 and 1910, get this, they cleared 190 million acres of forest for crops and pasture land. That's more than in the previous 250 years of European settlement. It's like 13.5 square miles of forest vanishing every single day. It's hard to imagine.
It's like watching an old-growth forest get bulldozed in fast forward. And what about logging? Were they doing anything to manage the forest sustainably?
In the early days, those sawmills were mostly small, local operations, often run by farmers who needed timber for themselves or to sell in the area. Larger logging companies were starting to appear, especially in the Great Lakes region and later in the South, but the whole idea was to get as much wood out as fast as possible. Sustainability wasn't really on their radar. But McCleary mentioned something interesting. The South actually had fewer of those huge destructive fires after logging compared to the North.
Why was that? You'd think with all that logging there'd be more fuel for fires.
Well, it might be because the South's pine forests were naturally more open, shaped by those frequent low-intensity fires, both natural ones and those set by Native Americans. And they kept burning the underbrush, which helped control those big blazes.
Makes sense. But what about the wildlife? I can't imagine it fared much better during this time of massive expansion and habitat destruction.
It was a rough time for a lot of animals.
Yeah.
The 1800s saw some truly devastating losses. The passenger pigeon, the bird that used to darken the skies with flocks numbering in the billions, gone, extinct. Overhunting and habitat loss. And the bison, out west, same story. They went from millions to almost nothing in just a few decades. Even deer, which are pretty adaptable, almost disappeared from much of the East by the late 1800s. It wasn't just about losing habitat, it was about being hunted relentlessly for food, for their hides, their fur, even their feathers for fancy hats. It was a sad chapter.
It's like this tale of unchecked greed, using up resources with no thought for tomorrow. But it sounds like this era also planted the seeds for the conservation movement. People had to start realizing things couldn't go on like this forever.
They did. By the late 1800s, more and more people, including some really influential folks, were sounding the alarm about the state of the forests and wildlife. They started questioning this idea that nature was an endless buffet. They worried about running out of timber, about more floods and erosion because there were no trees to hold the soil in place. They worried about losing all those incredible animals, about the beautiful landscapes disappearing, even about long-term changes to the climate.
It's interesting how these concerns echo today, but back then, who were some of the leading voices in this emerging conservation movement?
Well, there's this book from 1864, Man and Nature, by George Perkins Marsh. It was a real wake-up call. He argued that humans were messing things up big time, especially when it came to deforestation and how we were treating the land. His book really resonated with people and helped kickstart the whole conservation movement. And then you had these predictions about a national famine of wood starting as early as 1865 by people like Frederick Starr. They saw how much wood we were using and they knew it couldn't last forever.
So with all this concern brewing, what were some of the first steps they took to try and protect these forests and natural resources?
Well, at first it was a bit of a hodgepodge, but there were some important wins. They started setting aside protected areas, like Yosemite Valley in 1864, Yellowstone in 1872, and the Adirondack Forest Preserve in 1885. These are like the crown jewels, and they knew they had to protect them. And then in 1891, Congress did something really big. They gave the president the power to create forest reserves out of all that public land. It was a game changer. By 1897, they had over 40 million acres set aside.
So they finally put the brakes on all that public land being sold off, which had been happening for decades.
Exactly. It was a big shift in thinking. But even then, not everyone was on board. There was pushback, especially from people living near these new reserves. They worried about losing access to timber and grazing land. Plus, there weren't really clear plans for how to manage these reserves. It was a learning process.
So even in those early days, there was this tension between wanting to protect these special places and the need to use those resources. It's like a tug of war that continues to this day, right?
It is, and you had all these different voices weighing in. You had scientists like Bernhard Fernau, John Wesley Powell, and Arnold Haig, who really understood the science of forests and how to manage them sustainably. And then you had these influential groups like the American Forestry Association, which started back in 1875, and the Boone and Crockett Club, founded by Theodore Roosevelt and others in 1888. They were worried about all those animals disappearing. And they all pushed for both protecting and managing these forests wisely. All this led to a really important law, the 1897 Organic Act. This law finally gave those forest reserves a purpose. It said they were there to improve and protect the forest within the reservation or for the purpose of securing favorable conditions of water flows and to furnish a continuous supply of timber for the use and necessities of citizens of the United States.
It's like those forests finally had a job description, and it wasn't just about locking them up and throwing away the key.
Exactly. And right around this time, you had this idea gaining traction that natural resources, they weren't endless after all.
Right, and this is where we get that famous phrase, conservation as wise use, championed by folks like Gifford Pinchot or President Teddy Roosevelt. It
Yeah.
was different from simply preserving everything, right? It was about using resources responsibly.
Yeah, it was a very progressive era idea,
Hmm.
all about using science and planning to get the most out of our natural resources, not just for now, but for future generations too. They weren't saying don't touch anything. It's more like, let's be smart about this, manage things carefully.
And this period saw the birth of a lot of those big conservation groups that are still around today doing important work.
Oh yeah, you had the American Forestry Association, the Sierra Club, founded by John Muir, the Boone and Crockett Club, the Audubon Society, and later the Isaac Walton League. They all popped up around this time because people were starting to realize how much was at stake and that they had to organize and speak up.
So, as these early conservation efforts were getting off the ground, what was the overall state of American forests and wildlife around 1900?
It was still a mixed bag. Wildfires were raging out of control, burning something like 20 to 50 million acres every year. That's bigger than some states. There were millions of acres of cutover land, basically trashed after logging, and they were still cutting down trees faster than new ones could grow in lots of places. And tons of animals were struggling to survive, with some, like the passenger pigeon and the heath hen, on the very edge of disappearing forever.
It's like they were trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose, but they were starting to figure out a plan. So, what were the key strategies that emerged in the early 1900s to tackle all these problems?
By the 1930s, they had a multi-pronged attack. They focused on getting those wildfires under control, getting better at preventing and fighting them. They started applying more science to forest and wildlife management. Not just guesswork anymore. They worked with private landowners, helping them manage their forests better, offering tax breaks and advice. They got tougher on enforcing those wildlife protection laws. And they got strategic about acquiring more public land, not just for resources, but for conservation too. It was a real team effort with federal, state, and private groups all working together.
And it wasn't just about new laws and policies, was it? McCleary points to some major technological changes that took some of the pressure off the forests.
Right. Coal and oil started replacing wood as the main source of energy. Metal and concrete started being used more in construction. And then you had all those cool new inventions, like tractors replacing horses and mules on farms. This freed up a ton of land that was no longer needed for growing feed. These changes in technology had a huge impact. It's one of the reasons why forest area finally stopped shrinking in the early 1900s.
That's a turning point, right? After centuries of losing forests, they finally stopped the bleeding.
Exactly. And a big part of that was, like I said, they didn't need as much land for farming. They were getting way more food from the same amount of land. And those newfangled tractors and cars meant they didn't need to feed as many horses and mules, which took up a lot of space. Millions of acres of farmland, especially in the East, just weren't needed anymore.
And what happens to abandoned farmland? Nature takes over.
Exactly. It's like the forest saying, okay, I'm back. And you see this incredible comeback story in the eastern U.S. While the overall forest area in the country was stabilizing, the U.S. was actually gaining forests.
It's a comeback story for the ages, really. And as all this was happening, forestry itself was becoming a real profession. People were getting trained to manage forests and wildlife, not just winging it anymore.
Right, that professionalization was key. In the early 1900s, you could count the number of trained foresters on one hand, but then you had universities starting forestry schools and research really taking off. Places like the Forest Products Laboratory, founded in 1910, and the Forest Service's Research Branch in 1915, brought real science and expertise to the table.
But they still had that big problem with wildfires, right?
Yeah.
Especially in those early days.
Oh, yeah, those early 1900s were full of those massive, out-of-control fires. You're talking millions and millions of acres burning every year.
Yeah.
And you had some real tragedies, like the Yackle Fire in 1902 and the Big Burn in 1910, which killed 78 firefighters. Those events really woke people up.
It's hard to imagine a fire so big it could kill that many people.
Yeah, it was devastating. And it pushed them to get serious about fire prevention. That's when you had the Weeks Act in 1911 and the Clark-McNary Act in 1924. These laws provided federal funding and got the states and the feds working together to fight fires. And then, of course, who could forget Smokey Bear? Public education helped, too. By the late 1900s, the amount of land burned by wildfires had gone way down.
But I've heard that recently things have been getting worse again with those mega fires we keep hearing about.
That's right. There are a few reasons for that. Drought's a big one, and in some areas, the forests are actually too dense because they haven't had enough fire. So now they're trying to get back to a more balanced approach, using controlled burns and recognizing that fire's not always the enemy.
Makes sense. And while the feds were doing their thing, the states were also stepping up their game on the forest front.
For sure. The Weeks Act really got the ball rolling with those matching funds. States started beefing up their forestry agencies and even looked at changing their tax laws to encourage people to keep their land forested. And by the mid-1900s, states were calling the shots on managing private forests, first focusing on fire prevention and replanting trees, and later branching out to other environmental concerns, like how logging was done.
And what about wildlife? Was there a more organized effort to protect animals during this time?
Oh yeah, things were changing there too. Hunters and people who cared about wildlife, they started organizing. They wanted to stop that market hunting free-for-all and make sure there were laws to protect game animals. They pushed for better enforcement and even raised money to buy and protect important wildlife habitats. Groups like the Audubon Society, which started to protect birds from the feather trade, became big players in wildlife conservation.
So people were realizing they had to do more than just stop the killing. They had to protect the places where these animals lived.
Right, and after the 1920s, wildlife management got a lot more scientific. You had trained biologists coming on the scene, and they were doing things like reintroducing animals to areas where they disappeared. It was a new era.
And then there's the Eastern National Forests. Those are a little different from the ones out west, right?
Yeah, most Western national forests were carved out of land the government already owned. But in the East, they had to buy the land from private owners, often because it was all cut over and degraded. The Weeks Act in 1911 gave them the power to do that. It was about protecting those beat-up lands and making sure they had clean water. The first ones were in the Appalachian Mountains and the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the 1920s. Then, during the Depression, they bought a ton more land, creating forests from Florida all the way up to Wisconsin and from Vermont to Missouri. By 1945, they had about 24 million acres of this land that had been abused and neglected, and they were committed to restoring it.
So they were giving these lands a second chance. And after World War II, things changed again. What were some of the new challenges facing forests during this time?
Well, the war ended, and the economy took off. Everyone needed houses. And guess what they needed to build those houses? Timber. So demand went through the roof, and they leaned heavily on those national forests to meet the demand. But at the same time, more people had cars, more free time. They wanted to get out and enjoy nature. And guess where they went? Those same national forests. So you had this clash of interests with loggers wanting to harvest trees and people wanting to hike and camp and enjoy the scenery.
It's the tug of war again. And how did they handle this?
Well, they passed some pretty important laws. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in 1960 and the Wilderness Act in 1964. These laws said that they had to manage those national forests for a bunch of different uses, not just timber. And they also set aside some areas as wilderness, off limits to development.
So it was about finding a balance. And what about private forests? How were those being managed during this time?
Private forests went through their own transformation after the war. Timber prices were going up, and the government started offering tax breaks to people who planted trees and managed their forests for the long haul. So instead of just clear-cutting, a lot of folks started thinking about growing timber as a crop. And those big integrated forest product companies, they were buying up land and investing in planting and managing trees. Then, starting in the 1990s, you see a new kind of owner. These investment groups called TIMOs and REITs. They're mainly interested in timber as a financial asset like stocks or bonds. And now most of the timber of the U.S. comes from these private lands.
Interesting. So while those private forests were becoming more focused on producing timber, what was happening on the national forests?
Well, starting around